The wind howled down the Rockies like a living thing, carrying snow in blinding sheets. Trees groaned under the weight of ice, their limbs cracking in the night like gunshots echoing across the peaks. Out there, in the vast loneliness of the mountains, a man moved steadily through the storm. His name was Silas Boone. To the settlers, he was more beast than man, scarred from battles they never asked about, taller than most, a figure that drew whispers and warnings whenever he ventured into town. They said no woman in her right mind would marry a man like him. And perhaps they were right. He had long since stopped trying to change their minds. But that night, when he stumbled upon a wolf pup half buried in the snow, its small body trembling, Silas knelt without hesitation. He pulled the animal into his arms, wrapping it inside his fur coat. "Easy now," he muttered, his voice low and rough from years of solitude. The pup whimpered, then pressed against him, seeking warmth. Even in a land that gave nothing freely, Silas still gave what little he had. The storm raged for hours before it eased, revealing a moon as sharp and cold as a blade. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the nearest settlement, a cluster of cabins at the valley's edge. In that settlement, Silas was both feared and needed. His furs bought food, his hunting kept markets supplied with meat. Yet the people treated him like a shadow passing through. Mothers pulled their children close when he walked by. Men avoided his eyes. Women whispered. He traded quietly, leaving his pelts on the counter and taking what flour, beans, and salt he required. The storekeeper always counted twice, making sure no debt was left unpaid. Nobody spoke more than they had to. Silas carried the weight of their silence like another pack upon his shoulders. There had been a time, long ago, when he had dreamed of more. He once wore clean clothes, shaved his beard, and smiled easily. He had courted a woman named Eliza, soft-spoken and kind. They'd walked along riverbanks in the spring, speaking of cabins they might build, children they might raise. But wealth had lured her away to a rancher who offered gold and comfort. Silas had been left with nothing but his pride and the wilderness that did not judge him. Now, when people looked at his face, half hidden beneath a beard, scar carved across his cheek from a cougar's claw, they saw only danger. And he let them. Still, the world beyond his cabin pressed its troubles upon him. The war had ended, but not the violence. Bandits roamed freely, picking off travelers and torching wagons. News carried quick in small towns, and one tale in particular followed Silas like smoke. A woman, newly widowed, her husband slain by outlaws. Clara Dawson. She had a boy, 7 years old, maybe 8, and no one helped her through the winter. Men shook their heads when her name was mentioned. Some pitied her, some blamed her for not selling her land and leaving. Yet none stepped forward to offer aid. Women whispered, "She won't last till spring." And still, when someone joked about pairing her with the Scar Mountain man, the laughter cut sharp. Better starvation than Boone. Silas heard these words without flinching, though inside they landed heavier than bullets. He did not seek a wife, not anymore, but something inside him bristled at their cruelty. Clara Dawson. He remembered her faintly, saw her once, clinging to her husband's arm at market, her face pale but resolute. Now she lived alone on a farmstead by the creek, her child the only soul who shared her roof. Winter pressed harder, biting through the valley with storms that stripped flesh from bone. Silas returned to town once more, wolf pup trailing at his heel, grown stronger now under his care. He felt the usual stares. But that day something shifted. From across the street, he saw her, Clara Dawson, wrapped in a faded shawl, carrying a sack of grain on her back, though the weight nearly bent her in two. Her boy tugged at her hand, eyes wide with the innocent fear of a child who knows his mother is struggling but doesn't yet understand why. For the briefest moment, Clara's eyes lifted. They met Silas's across the snow-churned street. She froze, recognition flickering. Her gaze held a storm of emotions: fear, mistrust, curiosity. She did not look away as quickly as the others did. For Silas, that was more startling than the storm that had tried to bury him days earlier. He lowered his head, adjusted the strap of his pack, and walked on. But her eyes stayed with him, echoing in the silence of the mountains long after the town had fallen away behind him. That night, by the fire in his cabin, the wolf pup curled at his feet. Silas stared into the flames. He told himself it meant nothing, that the widow's gaze was just that, an accident. But some part of him, buried beneath years of solitude, stirred uneasily. The world was shifting, and whether he wished it or not, her path and his were drawing closer. Outside, the wind screamed through the pines like a warning. Morning broke gray and brittle over the valley, frost thick as glass across the ground. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the Dawson homestead, but inside, warmth was scarce. Clara Dawson stoked the last of the firewood, her hands red and raw from splitting logs too heavy for her frame. She paused only to glance at her son, Eli, still bundled beneath quilts. His face was pale, his ribs too sharp for a boy's age. Clara swallowed the knot in her throat and told herself there'd be enough food, enough warmth, if she could just make it to spring. Her husband had been gone nearly a year now. They had set out for Missouri with dreams of land and a better life, but dreams meant nothing against rifles in the night. Bandits had swarmed their wagon, stolen everything worth taking, and left her with a body to bury and a child to feed. She remembered his blood in the dirt, remembered Eli's cries, remembered the silence that followed when no one came to help. That silence still followed her. By day, she worked the homestead alone, mending fences, hauling water from the creek, patching leaks in the roof. Neighbors passed on the road sometimes, but they offered only nods or pitying glances. At the mercantile, whispers clung to her shoulders like shadows. Won't last till spring. They weren't wrong. Her food stores dwindled. Wolves prowled near the barn, their prints circling like vultures waiting for her strength to give out. One afternoon, she fought with a stubborn ox at the riverbank. The animal bellowed, rope slipping through her hands as it tried to bolt. She dug her heels into the frozen ground, heart pounding with the sickening thought of losing her only beast of burden. Suddenly, a hand closed over the rope. Strong, steady. Clara's breath hitched as she turned. It was him, the mountain man. Up close, Silas Boone was taller than she imagined, his coat thick with fur, his face half hidden by beard and shadow. A scar stretched across his cheek like a slash of lightning. For an instant, she thought the ox might tear her free of his grip, but Silas stood rooted like a pine tree in the earth. His voice was low, gravelly. Easy. The ox stilled as though the mountain itself had spoken. Clara stumbled back, pulse racing. She clutched Eli against her skirt as if shielding him from a storm. Silas's eyes flicked to the boy, then to her. He said nothing more, only released the rope gently into her hands. Then he turned and walked away, vanishing into the tree-line as silently as he had appeared. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the wolves. Eli whispered, "Mama, he helped us." She hushed him, though her own mind echoed with the memory of Silas's scar, his eyes, not cruel, not cold, but something else, something unreadable. Days later, when she opened her door one morning, she found a bundle resting on the step. Dried venison, a small sack of herbs, and a wolf-hide blanket, thick and warm. She looked around, but the yard was empty, only snow drifting in the wind. Eli beamed. "It's him," he said with certainty. Clara wanted to deny it, to cling to her fear, but her throat closed around the truth. Someone wanted them to live through the winter. In town, the gossip grew sharper. Boone's been prowling near her place. He'll bring trouble. Clara forced herself to keep her head high, though inside she wrestled with doubt. Was she fooled to let her son believe in the kindness of a man the world called savage? Or was she fooled to ignore the truth that no one else had lifted a hand to help her? The answer came one night in the roar of a blizzard. The storm came down sudden, furious, snow piling against the walls, wind rattling the roof beams until she feared the whole cabin might collapse. Eli clung to her, eyes wide with terror. Clara grabbed a hammer, trying to brace the timbers alone, her arms shaking with exhaustion. Then, another pair of hands joined hers. Strong, steady, sure. She gasped and turned, nearly dropping the hammer. Silas Boone was there, his coat powdered white with snow, his face drawn but determined. He said nothing. Together they drove stakes into the ground, bracing the cabin walls. He lifted beams Clara could never have moved, shored the roof against the storm's fury. Hours passed in grueling silence until at last the winds eased. When Clara looked up, the cabin still stood. Eli slept, safe and warm, beneath the wolf-hide blanket. Silas wiped sweat and snow from his brow. Their eyes met in the dim glow of the fire. For a long moment, Clara saw not the scar, not the whispers, but a man who had saved them without asking for thanks. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Before she could find them, Silas pulled on his coat and stepped back into the storm, vanishing once more into the wilderness. Clara stood at the door long after he was gone, the cold seeping through her bones. She did not understand why he came, why he cared, but in the silence that followed, she realized something had changed. The loneliness of her cabin felt less absolute. Somewhere out there, in a wild that had taken so much from her, someone had chosen, just once, not to take but to give. Spring was still months away, but in the Dawson homestead, time began to shift. The snow did not relent, yet Clara found her days colored by small, unexpected changes. Sometimes she'd discover tracks in the snow near the barn, boots too large to belong to any neighbor. Sometimes firewood would be stacked neatly outside her door, though she chopped none. And sometimes, on the edge of the tree line, she would glimpse him, watching silently before vanishing into the forest. At first, she thought him a ghost, some wandering shadow of the mountains. But Eli was braver than her. One morning, he slipped outside before Clara could stop him. She hurried after, fearing wolves, only to find Eli kneeling in the snow beside Silas Boone. The mountain man crouched low, showing the boy how to set a snare with patient, deliberate hands. His scar caught the morning light, but his eyes were softer than she expected, focused on teaching, not intimidating. Eli returned beaming, a rabbit dangling from the trap line. "He showed me," he said proudly. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, torn between gratitude and fear. Yet when she looked at Silas, she saw no menace. He only gave her a brief nod before disappearing once again into the woods. The days grew longer. Clara often found Eli whittling wood figures in the evening, tiny animals, rough but earnest. "He gave me the knife," Eli explained. Clara wanted to scold, to demand he return it, but she held her tongue. The figures lined the mantel, each a reminder that her son laughed again. Still, the world beyond their farm grew darker. Bandits roamed the valley once more, the same outlaws who had killed Clara's husband. Rumors spread of wagon trains burned, travelers shot and left in the snow. The sheriff rode from farm to farm warning families to keep rifles loaded. In town, people muttered that the Dawson homestead was ripe for the taking. A widow and her boy, alone and defenseless. Clara's nights filled with restless dreams. She would wake to every creak of the cabin, clutching her rifle, her heart pounding. But always in the silence, she wondered if Silas Boone was out there, keeping watch as he had during the storm. Then came a cougar. It was near dusk when Clara heard the panicked cries of her ox in the barn. She rushed outside with Eli close behind. There, in the fading light, she saw a blur of tawny fur leaping through the shadows, fangs flashing as it lunged for the animal's throat. Clara screamed, raising her rifle with trembling hands. But before she could fire, a shape moved faster than the beast. Silas. He slammed into the cougar with a force that sent both crashing into the snow. The animal snarled, claws raking across his arm, but Silas fought like a storm given flesh. Short, sharp blows, the flash of a hunting knife. The cougar thrashed, hissed, then went limp, its blood staining the snow red beneath the twilight. Clara stood frozen, rifle clutched tight, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Eli cheered, racing forward before she could stop him. Silas pushed himself to his feet, breathing hard, blood dripping from his sleeve. He looked at Clara then, really looked at her, as though waiting for judgment. She lowered the rifle slowly. "Why?" Her voice shook. "Why do you keep helping us?" Silas wiped his blade on the cougar's fur, his jaw tight. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice as rough as gravel, yet strangely fragile, he answered, "Because I know what it is to be left alone." Clara's throat closed. She wanted to ask more, but the words tangled. She could only watch as he lifted the cougar's body with ease and dragged it into the woods, disappearing once again. That night, while bandaging his sleeve, torn and bloodied where the cougar had struck, she thought of his words. She thought of the nights she'd cried into her pillow, wishing someone, anyone, would knock on her door and tell her she wasn't forgotten. She thought of the silence after her husband's death, of the neighbors who pitied but never helped. And she thought of Silas Boone, scarred and feared, who had asked for nothing yet given everything. Days later, Clara gathered her courage and spoke. She found him near the creek, skinning a deer he had caught. The smell of pine and blood filled the air. She clutched Eli's hand tight, though the boy seemed perfectly at ease. Silas looked up, his knife pausing mid-cut. "You don't owe us anything," Clara said quietly. His eyes narrowed, wary. "I know. Then why?" She stopped, her voice trembling. "Why risk yourself for us? Everyone else, they think you're dangerous." Silas studied her for a long, heavy silence. Then he set the knife down. His scar caught the light of the fading sun, harsh and unkind, but his eyes were something else entirely. "People see scars," he said, voice low. "Not the man." Clara felt her chest tighten. For the first time, she did not look away from him. For the first time, she saw past the wild beard, past the scar, past the silence. She saw the truth he carried, loneliness as sharp as her own. When she returned home that night, the mountains felt different. Still cold, still vast, still dangerous. But no longer empty. Somewhere in that wilderness, there was a man who had chosen to stand between her family and the darkness pressing in. For the first time since her husband's death, Clara Dawson allowed herself a fragile, fleeting hope. The night was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes the hair rise on the back of your neck. Clara woke first, heart pounding for no reason she could name. The fire had burned low, the cabin shadows long and restless. Then she heard it, the crunch of boots in snow. Not one pair, many. She slipped from bed, clutching the rifle to her chest. Eli stirred, whispering, "Mama." She hushed him, pressing a finger to her lips. Outside, voices carried low and cruel, men laughing the way wolves laugh before they close in. Bandits, the same outlaws who had killed her husband. She knew it in her bones. Before she could act, the front door shuddered against a heavy kick. Clara threw the bolt just in time, the wood groaning under the impact. Eli whimpered, and she pressed him close, whispering fierce promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Then the door burst inward. Lantern light spilled across, faces twisted with greed, rifles gleaming. Clara fired without thinking, the blast deafening in the small cabin. One outlaw staggered back, cursing, blood on his shirt. The others roared and surged forward. And then the storm itself seemed to break through the doorway. Silas Boone crashed into the cabin with a force that shook the walls. His rifle cracked, dropping one man where he stood. He swung the stock like a club, driving another to the floor. Clara barely had time to breathe before chaos swallowed the room. Gunpowder smoke, shouts, the crash of furniture splintering under boots. "Eli, hide!" Silas barked, voice raw. The boy scrambled under the bed, just as a bandit lunged at his mother. Clara swung the rifle like a staff, striking the man across the jaw. He reeled, but another grabbed her arm. She cried out, struggling, until Silas ripped the attacker away and drove him into the wall. The fight spilled outside into the snow. Lantern light flared, shadows twisting across the drifts. Silas moved with brutal precision, every blow born of years surviving beasts and men alike. 2 outlaws fell, clutching wounds. A third raised his pistol toward Clara where she stood in the doorway. Time slowed. She saw the flash, smelled the powder, heard the shot. But Silas had thrown himself between them, the bullet tearing into his shoulder. He grunted, staggering, blood soaking his coat. Clara screamed his name. her voice sharp as the crack of gunfire. Rage unlike anything she had known surged through her. She lifted her rifle, braced it against the doorframe, and fired. The bandit spun backward into the snow, still. The others hesitated. Perhaps it was the sight of their comrades lying dead. Perhaps it was the mountain man, bloodied but unbowed, standing tall as if the land itself had risen to defend the widow and her child. Whatever it was, their courage broke. They fled into the darkness, curses fading into the trees. Silence returned, broken only by the hiss of wind and Silas's ragged breathing. Clara dropped the rifle and rushed to his side. He leaned heavily against the wall, hand pressed to his shoulder where crimson spread too fast. "Stay awake," she begged, tears streaking her face. "Please stay with me." Eli crawled out from under the bed, wide-eyed, trembling. He knelt beside Silas, his small hand clutching the mountain man's coat. "Don't die," the boy whispered fiercely. "You can't." The sheriff arrived minutes later with a handful of men, too late to do more than count the bodies cooling in the snow. Their eyes widened at the sight. Boone standing guard though his shirt was soaked in blood, Clara Dawson at his side, rifle still smoking. Whispers spread quickly, some fearful, some reverent. For once, no one dared call him beast. They tended the dead and rode out, leaving Clara to bind Silas's wound by the fire. Her hand shook as she pressed cloth to his shoulder, though he never made a sound. Only once did he flinch, his eyes closing briefly. She leaned close, whispering, "You saved us." Again, his eyes opened, heavy with exhaustion. "Didn't do it for thanks." "I know," she said softly, "but I see you. I see who you are." For the first time, his gaze wavered, as if her words cut deeper than any blade. Days passed. Silas healed slowly in his mountain cabin, Wolf Pup curled beside him, loyal as any sentinel. Clara visited often, bringing soup, herbs, and quiet company. Eli darted about like a sparrow, chattering, unafraid. Silas listened more than he spoke, but sometimes his lips curved at the boy's laughter. One evening, snow melted just enough to reveal patches of earth, the first promise of spring. Clara stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching the firelight cast shadows across his scarred face. She took a breath, her hands trembling not from fear but from the weight of what she carried. "Nobody wanted to be your wife," she said softly. Her voice cracked on the words. "They said you were too wild, too dangerous. But I've seen your heart, Silas. Gentle, steadfast, stronger than anyone I've ever known." Silas's eyes lifted to hers, surprise flickering across features so long hardened by solitude. He said nothing, but his silence carried more than words ever could. Claire stepped closer, her voice low. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I want you with us. Me, Eli, not out there alone anymore." The fire popped softly, the only witness to the moment. For a long time, Silas said nothing. Then at last he nodded once, slow and deliberate. Not a promise of easy days, but an acknowledgement of the road ahead. Harsh, uncertain, yet shared. The mountains outside were still vast, still unforgiving. But inside that cabin, for the first time in years, warmth filled the silence. And so the tale of the feared mountain man became something else. Not a legend of violence, not a whisper of danger, but a story of how even in the harshest wilderness, love could take root when least expected. The camera would linger there, on the scarred man, the widow, and her boy, gathered by the fire as snow fell quietly beyond the window. A fragile family forged in the storm. If this story touched your heart, share it with others who believe love can bloom in the most unlikely places. Like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Frontier Tales for more stories of survival, resilience, and love in the untamed West.